Hey everyone. Thanks for joining us for Trib Talk. Today we've got me and my colleague Jessica Miller and the Salt Lake County District Attorney Sim Gill. We're here to talk about the office's recent decision to not charge officers in the Bernardo Palacios Carbajal shooting. And then we're also going to talk about Sim's recent proposal to change Utah's legal use of force standard to make it more similar to the standard regular people are held to. So first, Jessica is going to kind of take you through the background of this shooting, and then we'll have Sim talk kind of briefly about his decision, and then we'll get into the questions. There were quite a few of them, so I'm sorry if we can't get to them, but if if something comes up and you just have a burning question, feel free to send it to us using the hashtag Trib Talk. On Twitter or Facebook. So with that, Jessica, do you want to kind of go over the shooting?
Yeah, so this was a shooting that happened May 23rd. Bernardo Palacios Carbajal was running away from police. Officers had been called to a hotel room where a man had, or there's a report that a man had been robbed at gunpoint. And so when officers spotted Palacios Carbajal, he started running. They gave chase to him. And during this time, he was stumbling and dropping what later police found out to be a handgun. And so on this third time that he fell, that's when police officers shot at him once they realized that what he'd been dropping was a gun. And they shot at him 7 or 8 times initially, and then he sort of turned his body after he'd fallen to the ground, and they believed that he was pointing the gun at them, so they continued firing from there. So this happened, like I said, in May. Sim's office has been reviewing the case since then, and then last week he had a press conference and kind of walked through the findings. I know that was about an hour long, so hopefully we can get a really condensed version here. But Sim, could you kind of go through, what you believe made this shooting justified?
Sure. Well, first of all, let me just again extend my condolences to the Palacios Carbajal family for the loss of their loved one. And as I said, any time that we have loss of life in our community, that's a tragedy. And so I just want to do that as well. So yeah. So what we looked at is that we looked to see what were the underlying facts, and we had officers who were responding to an allegations of a couple of robberies that were happening in progress. They made contact, and Officer Iverson gave chase, and that chase was an extended chase that we showed there. But it all condensed down to converged into this parking lot where Officer Fortuna responded at that time, at the same time as Officer Iverson, who had been pursuing Mr. Carbajal. And Officer Fortuna arrived at the same time as that third fall. And both of them independently confirmed that they saw that gun come out. They saw Mr. Carbajal trying to pick the gun up, drop it, pick it up again. And at that point, they confirmed it was, in fact, a firearm. And based on the totality information they had, as well as what they felt, a threat to themselves, for their safety, for fellow officers, and for people in the community. So they fired about a burst of what we could figure out between 6 to 8 shots in that initial firing that occurred. Mr. Carbajal fell down. And based on what we had, he rolled over and presented both of his hands in an extended fashion, which I was able to zoom in on there. And they said in their testimonies, interviews, that they actually saw the gun being pointed at them. So they continued that lethal force, another burst of 6 to 8 fires. And subsequently, Mr. Carbajal died from his gunshot injuries. And what we found was the gun actually resting on top of his waist area. And so the law basically that we have to work with says that whether we agree with it or not, that a person who is alleged to have committed a felony, and especially a violent felony, and in this case we had evidence of violent felony, and who poses a danger and may be fleeing that and awaiting arrest, under the law, the police are authorized to use deadly and lethal force. And so that's one prong. Then the other prongs are the safety prongs for their personal safety and the safety of officers. And they also articulated in the totality of those facts that danger as well. And the challenge for our office really is to say, okay, what is the law? And then that belief that they had based on the objective facts, is it unreasonable? And if we try to criminally charge them, then I have to prove that that belief is not only unreasonable, but it is unreasonable beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's a very high threshold for us to cross. And the facts that we had, we could not refute what the officers were saying. In fact, it supported a lot of what the officers were saying. So based on that, we found the shooting to be justified under our state statute.
So I think the first question that we're going to get into after that is sort of more what your role was in making this decision. So this comes from Magdalena on Twitter. She said, I would sincerely like to understand the line in Sim's job between serving the people and serving the police. A very fair and valid criticism, in my view, of his press conference is that he sounded like a criminal prosecutor hired by the police department to make a case. And she continued on kind of making the point that, you know, in order to make reform happen, you're going to need these families on your side. And so like a press conference like that would erode the trust between families. So like, what is your role there?
So first of all, here's the thing. My goal is not to please one side or another. It is really trying to discover what the truth is. And sometimes that truth, it can be very uncomfortable and it can be very difficult. I don't work for the police. I work with the police. I'm not on their Christmas card list and holiday list. I don't get their endorsement, nor do I seek them out. And so I have been critical of the police when I think it's appropriate. And at the same time, my goal is to bring that information out and present it to the broadest community. And, you know, our office is really one of the very first offices that actually started doing that. We were early on the people who actually write our reports. We lay the law out, we lay the facts out, we lay the analysis out for everybody to look and review and judge, because we want to be transparent. So my goal is not to advocate for one side or another, but I have to sort of say, here are the facts, here's what I believe, and this is what I see when I go through that. And if that seemed to support one side, that wasn't being done in an intentional way. That's just sort of the reality of what I have and what I bring. And so I understand that when I bring that truth out, that as the messenger, I'm going to take criticism from either side of the equation, because one week when I find something to be questionable or unjustified, I'm a hero to one side and I'm a cad to the other side. And next week when that shifts, that shifts as well. So I know what my role is. My role is to just bring that truth out. I work ultimately for the citizens of Salt Lake County. That's who elected me. And that means all the citizens. And I have an obligation to lay that out from my understanding as objectively and as openly as I can. And that's the way I approach my work. But like I said, I don't work for the police. I work with them. I don't work for them. I work with them. But I work for the citizens of Salt Lake County.
I think that you've told Paighten and I in interviews in the past, you know, that if people want different outcomes, then the law needs to be changed. And yesterday you sent out a letter that had 22 proposed changes. That kind of ties into another question from a Twitter user named Marianne. She says, if your hands are truly tied by existing law, which laws specifically should be changed?
Right. And, you know, so thank you for asking that, Marianne, and thank you for raising this, Jessica, because it's something that I've been thinking about and our team have been thinking of for a long time. And we've always sort of said that our job is to bring that, the way we've done our reports is to be open and transparent. And we know that our reports are going to make people angry, but we also want them to be informed. And we also want to demonstrate to them where those deficits might be, because as an informed community, then if we don't like these outcomes, which are not consistent with our ideals, then we need to change the law so we can have the different outcomes that we do want. And so it also became pretty clear to me that in light of just at this moment that we're at, there is a community of citizens out there saying we don't like what we're getting. And then I have policymakers who are trying to figure out what to give to them. And so we just said, you know, we're going to go ahead and put this out. You don't have to like my proposal. You don't have to support my proposals. But here they are, which I think would have an impact on the outcomes and certainly on the kind of accountability that people are looking for. And here's a set of proposals. So let's have a healthy discussion about it. Let's show the pros, show the cons, and let's talk about the values that we want. Because right now, if you're a violent felon who's fleeing with a weapon, under the law, the police can shoot at you. If that's not a value that we want, then let's go ahead and correct that. Let's narrow the categories of on what constitutes a violent felony and under what circumstances, even if somebody's fleeing. But that's going to require debate from both sides. And then as a product of participatory democracy, we'll get that. I have no doubt that even when I came out with the proposal, there's probably many officers who are upset at me even suggesting that we have this conversation. But my point is, I have no doubt that law enforcement will rise to the standard that we put them for them as a statute, because that's what the law is going to be, and that's what they're going to be held accountable for. But then let's be clear about it and say these are our ideals, these are our values, and that's really where that change, systemic change, is going to occur. That's where long-term sustainable change is going to occur. I can file a charge as a prosecutor against anybody you want me to. You can point somebody, I could theoretically file charges against them, but it would be a miscarriage of justice because I am not applying the law, and then it'll get thrown out of the court. And after a while, it will erode the message that we are trying to say, that this is in need of reform. So the way I've approached this, I said, here are these things. I've invited, we sent it out to all the legislators. We said, here they are. This next legislative session, you can't say that nobody sent you something to think about. And I invite also the community of our citizens, those who are protesting, who or those who may say that we want something else. My list is not exhaustive. It's an invitation for this necessary conversation to occur if we want long-term sustainable systemic change.
I think it might be helpful to maybe run through some of those changes that you proposed. So like one of them that really stood out was this idea of, because right now the law basically says if a police officer reasonably believes that a person could kill them or somebody else, that they're authorized in using lethal force. And you wanted to change it to more of the standard that would, like, for me, if I decided to shoot somebody, like,
right.
So what is the difference?
So the idea is, we do create, and it's an acknowledgement. It's not meant as a criticism or anything. It's the reality that given what the work officers do, there is a lot more flexibility in terms of the bar that sets for officers to use of force. The bar for prosecution is really high. So the idea there is to say, okay, do you want to set the bar which is available for everybody? And that also means that we have to start looking at the imminence that is there, and it also means that you can't contribute to that exigency, right? It also means that sometimes we have also a doctrine called the imperfect self-defense. So a homeowner can still be charged with the murder, but since it was an imperfect self-defense, it'll be a manslaughter than a murder because they thought that the intruder was coming in, or they were mistaken that he had, or whatever. And so this is, again, an attempt to say, here's an example of how you can address this issue. And if you think that police officers have too much leeway, here's one way to equalize that. And the other things that we talked about, Paighten, were, for example, should an officer have access to a justification defense if they create the exigency, which then becomes the rationalization to use that lethal or deadly force?
So, like, if they escalate the situation, is that what
that's right? So, for example, I'll give it to you this way. Early on, when we came down, there were a lot of police shootings that were occurring at moving cars. And so I asked just a fundamental question. I said, well, hang on a second. I have an officer who's stepping out into the road, and then I have a police officer, the person is driving, and they're saying, now I'm in fear of my life. And then you've sort of created the exigency, which is the justification, right? And maybe in that scenario, that shouldn't be there. The analogy that I remember talking to some police officers and some chiefs was, if a wrecking ball starts its downward descent with 2,000 pounds and you jump in front and fire at the wrecking ball, nothing's going to happen. the prudence would be to jump out of the way, not just hold your ground and say, my life is being put in danger. So that exigency, it doesn't sit well with people. So I think that's a reasonable thing for us to consider. Then we've also proposed to the other point, Paighten, is that should we make conditions for de-escalation? And if you reasonably did not take the steps toward de-escalation, then maybe the justification statute should not be available to you in terms of what we expect a reasonable officer to do. The other proposals that we proposed, we went up on the Hill and we've tried to advocate for, is the access of grand juries directly to prosecutors. Around the country, prosecution offices have direct access to grand juries. In Utah, I have to go to a panel of judges and ask for special permission. There's no criteria when they can give it to me or won't give it to me. And so we've proposed, even in a narrow way, and I'll pick up the cost. I'm willing to pay for the grand jury myself. I even told them that, so there's no fiscal note. So in incidents of officer-involved shooting, that I have access to a grand jury, so because I can put people under oath, take their testimony, and gather that evidence, because sometimes people are not always cooperating. Other proposals that we've talked about is for example, creating a statewide database for misconduct of officers, that if there's a finding that becomes public record and is accessible to prosecutors, so one bad officer transferring to another jurisdiction, they can't hide in the crowd, if you will, and that information is made available to us. So these are all different sort of ideas by which we can move that ball forward for the kind of reforms that we want if we want different outcomes.
So obviously these proposed changes come just a couple of days after your decision in Palacio Carvajal's case. But, we're in this moment right now where across the country, people are analyzing police use of force and kind of what is acceptable and what's not. Did the Palacio Carvajal case influence your suggested changes at all? Have there been any cases that, maybe you ruled one way because it was the law, but influenced, these proposed changes that you're making now?
Yeah, I think that if these, let's say if you and I can play this sort of hypothetical game, if some of these were in place, of course they would have an impact on the ultimate conclusions that I would reach. There's no doubt about that. And not only the Palacio Carvajal matter, but all the cases that our office has looked at, we take very seriously. And there are cases that certainly have left their imprint on me in a way that I feel like, okay, I wish the law was different, because I wish that I had more ability to be able to advocate or to move this issue forward. But I know legally where that wall is going to be, and we're going to go no further than that. And so I can honestly say that it certainly would have had an impact on many of those cases that we've reviewed. And the outcomes could have been definitely a lot different. Yes.
So I think we're going to move to another Twitter question that we got. This one is a little bit different than what we've been talking about, but it has to do with the protests that followed this decision, and obviously happened before it too. But the question is from a Twitter follower, and they said, "I would like to know how he plans to justify the arrest of protest organizers and protesters for frivolous charges that look a lot like suppression of our First Amendment right to gather and speak freely, or if he condemns those arrests." And so I know that, for instance, from the first few protests, you opted not to file charges for the people that didn't disperse when we had that curfew. So, I mean, sort of walk me through your thinking.
Sure, absolutely. I think so. First and foremost, I absolutely believe in our constitutional right to peacefully protest. I think we should question our leadership. We should question every elected official, including myself, and we should always do an institutional check, and that is a fundamental right that we have. I support that. I'm proud of that when the protesters go out and do that. Excuse me. And I have participated myself in many protests, because I think that's a great way to voice your concern. So to the question directly, you're right, Paighten, because I took some flack from people saying when I dismissed about 40 cases of protesters from that initial protest, because the objective was, and I told this to Mayor Mendenhall, and she was supportive of it. She didn't question that. And I also told it to some officers who took umbrage at me dismissing, and some valley chiefs around the county. And I said, look, everybody has a right to protest. The objective was to clear the park. These individuals were there. The underlying objective was achieved. And it makes no sense for us, given we're in COVID, and given that we achieved the objective, to further criminalize and prosecute this case, because that's not necessary in the broader sense of justice. But at the same time, then there are individuals who engage in violent acts. So in fact, even as we're speaking, in about an hour and a half or two, we're going to have the preliminary hearing on Mr. McCormick, who showed up there, the bow and arrow guy, right? Mm-hmm. He came in there and he engaged in a violent act, and he certainly is going to claim that he was out there exercising his First Amendment right. Well, his First Amendment right crossed over into what I would call a threatening behavior in a way that put other people at risk. And so we charged criminal charges against Mr. McCormick. Then there were individuals who upturned the police car and set it on fire. And that was a destruction of property. That was a violent act. There were other people who were attacked. And for those individuals, we would prosecute. So I draw that line in a very clear way. When you start to violate other people's rights, or are threatening to other people, or you start destroying property, then you have moved that from the core. And let me underscore, in my humble opinion, majority of the individuals who are out there have a valid and constitutionally protected right to go out there and protest. But then those who start engaging in destruction of property or start crossing that threshold, they're not, I don't put them in the same category. That has crossed over in a line in a way that I think we have to enforce in, and we have, and we will.
I know that last week that there was a couple of protesters arrested after your decision came out involving the Palacios Carbajal case. And in particular, the allegations that they damaged your building, that it was, your office, you're essentially the victim, more or less. Mm-hmm. Is there any sort of conflict of interest there? Will your office be prosecuting those cases, or how does that work when it's an action that's directed at you?
That's a great question. And yes, we will be sort of going through that conflicts checks as we do with almost every case that comes through there. And if the nexus is too close, then we will make the initial decision and we'll send it out, and we'll bring an outside prosecutor to do that. And that's something I've directed our prosecutors to already start reviewing and making sure that we have our conflicts checks. And if there's a conflict, absolutely, we will not be doing it. And I can see that there most likely will be a conflict on some of those individuals where the attack was directly against. Theoretically, I can intellectually separate it, but from a perceptual perspective, we don't even want to have that. So we'll have that most likely be prosecuted by an outside prosecutor.
I wanted to kind of tag on to this idea of like property damage, because a lot of the pushback that I've seen from protesters is like, they're taxpayers. They decided to buy paint and paint the road or break the windows of a publicly funded building and stuff like that. And so they see the charges coming against them because of stuff like this as just the fundamental belief that property matters more than people's lives, because what they're fighting for, is, to try to get justice in somebody's death, by police. I mean, what do you make of this idea that it seems like we value property more than people?
I don't think it's a question of valuing property more. I think the question is whether a threshold is crossed or not. Because I absolutely believe and support the idea of peaceful protest, even direct agitation where you get loud and get in somebody's face. I get that. But where you start to threaten or destroy property, so while that taxpayer who decides that they're going to break this window because they're a taxpayer, there's also 1.1 million taxpayers, or in this county, who are saying, "Hang on a second, that's our property too." And why should so if you take almost $200,000 in damages, it's going to come out from everybody. It's not just that one person. That gave me, if they came up and said, "Oh, look, here's my $200,000 I gave you, and here's my right to bust this window," that's not how it works, right? So it is crossing that threshold, and there is a large number in our community that says, "Look, when you cross that threshold, as a part of our collective value, is to maintain a certain level of order." And so I think that's what it is. Now, that's not to equivocate and say that the loss of human life is any less important. But I think to say, well, because there's a loss of human life here, that means that I get to go destroy all this over here, and then I get to pose a human life as the justification. That seems and also suspect in the sense that other citizens say, hang on, this is a public institution, this is a public building, and this is a valid argument that you're raising, but this is an equivocation that the threshold that we're not going to let you cross. And I think we have to sort of maintain that sort of balance. What does that look like? And I think the threshold that was set is, look, if you start attacking people or destroying property, then it is getting out of hand, because then nobody has responsibility for it. Remember, the rooms that got destroyed are where my victims come and wait, right? That's where my victims come and wait, who have been victimized by crime, and they are going their wait there to go to adjudicate and speak out against their perpetrators. That's the room that they destroyed. So I understand the emotions behind it, but I think we have to have a threshold that says, yes, this is where we get to do it peacefully. This is where it is unacceptable, and that's the rules of our society.
Gotcha.
So I want to turn to a question that was emailed to us by Michael and Nina Vaught. They said, why should we believe that a few tweaks or even comprehensive tweaks to the existing laws will make any difference when, even with clear video evidence to the contrary, you're willing to base your judgment on an officer's story?
Okay, so I have not always just based it on officer stories, and both of you have covered this beat long enough to know I don't get cooperation from officers all the time. I have officers who refuse to talk to me. That still does not absolve me of my effort to find the truth, even if it may be fragmented, to try to make an attempt to gather as much information that I can so I can present it to our community. And the person who asked the question, they should be suspicious because a few tweaks are not going to fix this. This is what's fascinating to me. This is not something that happened just because of George Floyd. There was Ahmaud Arbery, there was Tamir Rice, there was Trayvon Martin, there was Eric Garner. There is a long list of these in our history. And every 20 or 30 years, we have this sort of societal explosion. And then you get these wonderful platitudes about opening up listening tours, creating committees, and, we're going to do this, and we sort of do this. Here's an opportunity for us to seriously sort of have that hard question, and some of the answers we may not like through this participatory democracy, which is to say, this is what we want, this is the law that how we want to change it, and can we change it this way because this is the outcome that we desire? And that's a political process. And I need enough of a flexibility within those parameters to be able to alter that outcome, if you will. And so it's not taking, that's why my reviews take as long as they do, because just because the police or somebody presents me, I don't take it at face value. We go through our own attempt to gather that information and be deliberate about it and be thorough about it, and then make our conclusion on the best available information that we have. So no, I don't want to even send a message that somehow these things that I propose, my list is not exhaustive. It's an invitation for a necessary and long overdue conversation. And I can tell you, there's going to be resistance on the Hill. If I'm being absolutely honest and pragmatic, there's going to be resistance on the Hill. But at the same time, I didn't want to let the opportunity go by to say to the legislatures, here's how you start. You can't say that nobody sent you anything. And I encourage everybody to reach out to their legislators, reach out to these groups that are coming together to say, here's our proposal. We don't like some proposal, here's our proposal. Or his doesn't go far enough. Here's what we want you to do. And we have to go through that process because at some level, we have to say, whether we like it or not, these are the values and the ideals that we have reached by consensus. And we still need to do more to change, but that's our process. But that's the only way we're going to be able to do it,
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I was going to say, while I've reviewed more cases than anybody else, I'm also the only DA who's found what 7 people to be unjustified, and I've tried to prosecute 3. So and that was unheard of when we came into our administration. Over the last 10 years, we have made incremental gains but I can't do this job myself. I need the help of our community of citizens to help change the statute if we want different outcomes.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what your final thoughts were, but I think that about covers it. And so we have like 9 seconds left. Any other thing you want to say? I mean,
this is an important moment, and if we simply think that this is about police reform and police brutality, then we're going to miss the opportunity. This is not only an indictment of our criminal justice system and our police, it is an indictment of our political system, and that is the opportunity here, because we've had over 400 years of discrimination against a community of citizens. And this is something that has been part of our pattern of history. So here's an opportunity for us to address this collectively, because it is the public policy failures that manifest themselves as crisis. We look to law enforcement to be our crisis managers. And then in application, they disproportionately impact communities of color and poverty. And we need to go back to those public policy failures of education, of mental health, of public health, of jobs, of economic ability to move. And it is those public policy failures that have contributed to this an apex of our criminal justice reform. But this conversation is an indictment of our entire political system. That's what our moment is about. So I don't want us to lose that either.
Got you. Well, thanks so much for taking some time, Sim. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Sure.